The first strike of the high-carbon steel pickaxe against the frozen Wyoming earth rang out like a rifle shot across the Laramie Basin. It was the morning of October 3rd, 1881. The ambient air temperature hovered at a deceptive 28 degrees, the kind of crisp, bright autumn morning that felt entirely manageable right up until the wind shifted and the shadows lengthened. Elara Vance, a 38-year-old widow with hands heavily calloused from a lifetime of relentless physical labor, stood inside the skeletal roofed framing of her unfinished 16 by 20-foot cabin. She had not yet laid the floorboards. Instead, she was standing in the center of the dirt footprint, methodically carving a massive 12 by 14-foot crater directly into the earth beneath where her kitchen and living space were supposed to be. To the casual observer, driving a buckboard wagon past her isolated claim on the western edge of the booming railroad town, it looked for all the world as though the woman was excavating her own grave. In a psychological sense, the townspeople believed she was doing exactly that. Elara had arrived in the Wyoming Territory 6 weeks earlier, the silent trailing anchor of a larger wagon train. She stepped off with exactly $14.50 in silver coins sewn into the hem of her wool skirt, a heavy canvas bag containing her late husband's masonry and carpentry tools, and a homestead patent for 160 acres of land that consisted almost entirely of sagebrush, limestone gravel, and glacial till. Her husband, Elias, a Welsh coal miner with a deep, intuitive grasp of subterranean engineering, had died in a tunnel collapse in the anthracite fields of Pennsylvania 2 years prior. He had left her with no financial inheritance, no life insurance, and no immediate family. But he had left her with something far more valuable for a solitary settler facing the brutal arithmetic of the American frontier: a cellular understanding of deep earth thermodynamics, subterranean airflow, and structural load distribution. The Laramie Basin in the late 19th century was not a place that forgave ignorance. Here, winter was not merely a season, it was an apex predator. By late November, the region would be plunged into a 6-month deep freeze. Temperatures routinely plummeted to 30, sometimes 40 degrees below zero. These catastrophic drops in temperature were always accompanied by winds that swept down from the Snowy Range at 50 to 60 miles per hour, turning the landscape into a blinding white ocean of suspended ice crystals. To survive from November through April in a single-room, uninsulated wooden cabin, a homesteader required fuel, specifically an absolute minimum of 6 cords of properly seasoned firewood. A cord is not a casual measurement. It is a precise geometric volume of timber, 4 feet high, 4 feet wide, and 8 feet long, totaling 128 cubic feet of tightly stacked wood. 6 cords meant Elara needed roughly 768 cubic feet of timber, weighing somewhere in the neighborhood of 15,000 pounds. But merely possessing the wood was only half of the survival equation. The wood had to remain absolutely, unequivocally dry. The conventional wisdom of the 1880s, the proper way of establishing a homestead, dictated that a settler should build a separate, above-ground woodshed. A standard 10 by 12-foot shed, constructed from milled dimensional lumber with a shingled pitch roof and a raised wooden plank floor to prevent ground rot, cost approximately $45 in materials at the local lumberyard. Elara had $50. She could not afford the lumber, the nails, or the hinges for a separate structure. The only other alternative, the desperate measure that impoverished newcomers inevitably attempted, was to stack their chopped wood outdoors, leaning it against the cabin's leeward wall and perhaps covering it with a scavenged canvas tarp, hoping for the best. Elara knew exactly how that story ended. When a high plains blizzard strikes, it does not drop snow vertically. It drives it horizontally with terrifying kinetic force. Fine, powdery snow infiltrates every microscopic gap, every crevice, burying outdoor woodpiles under compacted drifts that can reach 8 feet deep. When the ambient temperature briefly rises during the midday sun, the top layer of that snow melts, seeping down into the stacked logs. When the sun sets and the temperature violently crashes back below zero, The entire woodpile flash freezes into a solid, impenetrable monolith of ice. Physics is the only judge that matters when the temperature drops to the -30s. Nature doesn't care about your pride, your intentions, or your poverty. If you attempt to burn wet, green, or ice-encrusted wood in a cast-iron stove, the thermal energy of the fire is entirely hijacked. Instead of radiating life-saving heat into the room, the fire's British thermal units, the BTUs, are expended on a useless chemical process, boiling the water trapped inside the cellular structure of the timber and converting it into steam. The combustion temperature plummets instantly. The fire smolders. It produces heavy, choking black smoke and massive amounts of creosote. Creosote is a highly flammable, tar-like substance that coats the inside of the chimney flue. When it builds up, it inevitably sparks catastrophic chimney fires, burning the settlers' only shelter to the ground in the middle of a blizzard. Ilara understood that storing her winter fuel above ground, exposed to the raw, unfiltered violence of the Wyoming plains, was a gamble she absolutely could not afford. She needed her firewood to remain at a constant low moisture content of exactly 12% to 15%. She needed it easily accessible in the middle of a midnight whiteout, without having to put on a heavy coat and boots, risk losing her bearing in the dark, and freeze to death just 10 feet from her own door simply to feed the stove. And she needed all of this secured in a place that wouldn't cost her $45 to build. So, Ilara looked downward. She remembered her husband's diagrams, drawn in charcoal on the back of torn envelopes. She remembered the physics of the mines. Beneath the frost line, the depth to which groundwater in soil is expected to freeze, the Earth acts as a massive, infinite thermal battery. In the Laramie Basin, once you excavate past the first 4 feet of topsoil and permafrost, the ambient temperature of the deep Earth stabilizes. It holds at a constant, unwavering 50 degrees to 52 degrees, regardless of whether the surface temperature is a blistering 100 degrees in August or a lethal 41 degrees in January. If she could excavate a massive vault directly beneath her cabin floor, she wouldn't just be creating a dry, windproof storage space for her 15,000 pounds of firewood. She would be anchoring her fragile wooden home to a 52-degree thermal mass. She would be fundamentally altering the thermodynamic baseline of her own survival. But the people of Laramie in 1881 did not understand thermal mass. They did not understand subterranean moisture control or the physics of geothermal buffering. They understood tradition. They understood how things had always been done. And they understood fear of the unknown. As Ilara's pickaxe bit deeper into the stubborn Wyoming clay, day after day, week after week, the town began to notice the massive piles of excavated earth accumulating in her yard. They began to whisper, and very quickly, the whispers turned into open, arrogant mockery. If you are the kind of person who values practical wisdom over popular opinion, who respects the ingenuity of those who had to think or die, and who understands that human survival has always depended on working with nature rather than fighting it, hit that subscribe button to help preserve these forgotten frontier techniques. Also, comment below, which city are you watching from? The sheer physical arithmetic of what Ilara Vance was attempting bordered on the impossible for a single human being, let alone a widow subsisting on salt pork and watered-down coffee. To excavate a chamber 12 feet wide, 14 feet long, and 7 feet deep meant displacing roughly 1,176 cubic feet of compacted Wyoming earth. That equated to moving over 100,000 pounds of dirt, clay, and glacial rock using nothing but a high-carbon steel pickaxe, a flat-headed spade, and a splintering wooden wheelbarrow. She worked in a relentless, mechanical rhythm from the first pale light of dawn until the lantern fuel burned out at night. The skin on her palms blistered, tore, bled, and eventually hardened into a thick, unfeeling callus. But the physical labor was merely the execution. The true brilliance lay in the subterranean engineering. To dig a hole is simple. To dig a hole that will not collapse under the immense lateral pressure of the surrounding earth, nor flood with groundwater during the spring thaw, requires an intimate understanding of geological physics. Ilara employed a technique her husband Elias had used in the unstable anthracite coal veins of Pennsylvania. Instead of cutting the earthen walls at a perfect vertical 90-degree angle, she carved them with a precise 5-degree inward batter. By angling the dirt walls slightly inward from top to bottom, the lateral weight of the surrounding soil was mechanically redirected downward into the floor of the vault, rather than pushing horizontally into the empty space. It was a vernacular retaining wall, utilizing gravity to defeat gravity. But structural integrity was only the first hurdle. The silent, invisible killer of any underground structure in the 19th century was moisture. On October 18, 1881, the first of the town's skeptics arrived to point this out. Elias Galt was a 42-year-old master carpenter from Ohio who had built half the false front commercial buildings on Laramie's main street. He was a man who believed in milled lumber, plumb lines, and the absolute superiority of established American building traditions. He parked his pristine buckboard wagon, walked through Ilara's doorless cabin framing, and looked down into the massive echoing cavern she was carving. He scoffed loudly, the sound bouncing off the clay walls. "Mrs. Vance," Galt said, hooking his thumbs into his heavy canvas suspenders. "I don't know what kind of desperation drove you to this, but out here, you put a hole like that under a wooden floor. You are asking for the devil's own rot. The earth holds water. When the temperature drops, the dew point is going to hit the underside of your floorboards. That rising damp will condense, and it will turn your pine joists into mush within 2 seasons. And if the black mold doesn't ruin your lungs, the stagnant air will suffocate your fire. You're building a grave." Ilara did not stop digging. She drove the spade into the clay, leaned her weight onto the handle, and looked up at the carpenter. "Mr. Galt, stagnant air only exists where there is an absence of a pressure differential," she said, her voice steady and carrying the quiet authority of someone who understood the mathematics of survival. "I am installing a downcast and an upcast ventilation shaft." Galt frowned, his confidence faltering for a fraction of a second. "A what?" "It is standard Welsh coal mining technology," Ilara explained, pointing to a trench she was digging along the northern perimeter. "You cannot put men 1,000 feet underground without moving the atmosphere. I am running a 6-inch fired clay pipe from the exterior of the cabin's north wall, sloping it downward at a steep angle directly into the base of this vault. That is the downcast. It will pull heavy, cold, dry winter air in from the outside." She then pointed up toward the framing of her roof. "On the opposite side, directly beneath where my cast-iron cookstove will sit in the cabin above, I am leaving a louvered iron grate in the floorboards. That is the upcast. When the stove is burning, it creates a massive thermal updraft. It consumes oxygen rapidly. That draft will pull the air up from the vault through the floor grate. The vacuum created in the vault will forcibly pull fresh, dry winter air in through the downcast pipe outside. The air will constantly, cyclically circulate through the stacked firewood, stripping away any ambient moisture and exhausting it straight up the cabin's chimney. The wood stays dry, the joists stay dry, and the dew point is never reached." Galt stared at the complex clay pipe staging she had already laid out. It was a masterpiece of passive convection currents. "It's unnatural," he muttered, unable to refute the physics, but fundamentally unwilling to accept the break from convention. "A house belongs on top of the earth, widow, not buried inside it." He walked away, but the physics of moisture management did not end with airflow. Groundwater was the second enemy. To combat this, Ilara hand-dug a perimeter trench at the absolute bottom of the vault, grading it at a precise drainage pitch of 1 inch of drop for every 4 feet of horizontal run. This trench fed into a 3-foot-deep sump hole located in the lowest corner of the vault, filled with coarse, porous river gravel she had hauled bucket by bucket from the Laramie River. Because the bottom of the sump pit sat well below the frost line, any ambient groundwater that seeped into the vault would naturally flow into the gravel and slowly percolate back into the deeper water table, keeping the vault floor bone dry. 2 days later, the second skeptic arrived. Silas Thorne was a 55-year-old cattle baron who ran 3,000 head of beef on the benchlands north of town. He rode a $200 thoroughbred and possessed the specific, dangerous arrogance that accompanies immense frontier wealth. Thorne did not dismount. He rode his massive horse right up to the edge of her foundation, looking down at the excavation with undisguised contempt. "You are undermining your own foundation, woman," Thorne barked, his breath pluming in the crisp October air. "You put the dead load weight of a furnished cabin, a heavy cast-iron stove, and the live load of a 3-foot winter snowpack on those outer sills, and that dirt bank is going to fail. The lateral compression will buckle. The whole house will collapse into that pit, and it'll crush you while you sleep." Ilara stopped wiping down her tools and met his gaze. "I am not resting the floor joists on the dirt bank, Mr. Thorne. I am not a fool." She pointed to 8 massive, debarked lodgepole pine logs lying in the grass. "I have sunk 8 load-bearing posts, each 12 inches in diameter, directly into the bedrock at the bottom of the vault. They are cross-braced with heavy iron lag bolts. The 2x8 floor joists will span across those posts, completely independent of the earthen walls. The floor of my cabin is floating above the vault, supported by a timber framework that could hold the weight of a Union Pacific locomotive. The earth walls bear 0 structural load." Thorne scoffed, his horse prancing nervously at the edge of the pit. "Nature doesn't care about your pride, widow. You try to reinvent the wheel out here to save a few dollars on a proper shed. You end up freezing to death. You are fighting the way things are done." "I am not fighting anything," Ilara replied softly. "I am using the Earth's thermal lag to my advantage. You are the one fighting the wind, Mr. Thorne." But the technical criticism was merely the beginning. The social isolation on the frontier was a weapon all its own. To survive differently was to invite suspicion. To innovate while impoverished was considered an insult to those who had paid dearly for conventional respectability. In early November, Reverend Josiah Hale arrived. He was a man whose rigid interpretation of Scripture extended to how a proper Christian homestead ought to be organized. He was accompanied by Martha Higgins, the town's preeminent gossip who ran the local dry goods store. They found Ilara constructing the massive 3-by-4-foot trapdoor that would sit flush in the center of her cabin floor. "Mrs. Vance," Reverend Hale intoned, looking down his nose at the heavy iron hinges she was securing. "A home is meant to be a place of light. It is meant to be a testament to Christian transparency, digging secret, subterranean vaults under your floorboards. It speaks of hoarding. It speaks of a secretive, untrusting nature. A woman alone ought to rely on the charity of the congregation, not burrow into the cold earth like a feral animal." Martha Higgins tightened her woolen shawl against the biting wind. "Folks are talking, Ilara. They're saying you've lost your mind to grief. It's an absolute eyesore, having that giant pile of excavated dirt sitting in your yard instead of a neat, whitewashed woodshed. A proper woodshed is a sign of a respectable, forward-thinking homesteader. This is just bizarre." Ilara paused, holding a heavy, square-cut nail between her calloused fingers. "A proper, milled lumber woodshed costs $45, Martha. I have exactly $8 left to my name. I will spend that money on 50 pounds of flour, 10 pounds of salt pork, and coffee. When the mercury drops to 30 below zero, the Lord won't care if my firewood is stored in a respectably painted shed or an earthen vault. He will only care if the wood catches a spark and keeps my blood moving." By November 15th, the vault was entirely finished. Ilara laid the wide plank pine floorboards across the heavy, independent joists, securing them tightly. In the center of the room, directly beneath where her heavy oak dining table would eventually sit, the large trapdoor rested flush with the floor. Because the door weighed nearly 80 pounds, she had engineered a clever counterweight system using a scavenged iron pulley and a canvas bag filled with river rocks. allowing her to lift the massive door with a gentle pull of one hand. Over the next 3 weeks, she traded her labor, washing heavy, grease-stained laundry for the railroad men and mending canvas tents, in exchange for the right to harvest dead-standing lodgepole pine from a local timber claim. She hauled the wood back in a borrowed handcart, making dozens of exhausting trips. She chopped it into precise 16-inch splits and lowered them piece by piece into the vault. She stacked the wood methodically, using a specific crisscross pattern called cribbing to maximize the surface area exposed to the ventilation drafts she had engineered. By the first week of December 1881, she had 6 full cords of wood neatly stacked in the subterranean dark beneath her feet. The trap door was shut tight. A braided rag rug was placed over it. The cabin was sealed, and from the outside, it looked exactly like any other modest, perhaps slightly impoverished, frontier home. The town of Laramie laughed. They openly called her homestead the Widow's Tomb. The men placed wagers at the local saloon, betting whiskey on whether the floor would collapse under its own weight by Christmas, or if she would simply freeze to death when her secret vault inevitably filled with spring snowmelt. But down in the absolute dark, bathed in the constant geothermal embrace of the deep earth, Ilara's 15,000 pounds of firewood was quietly curing. The convection currents were gently wicking away the last remnants of sap and moisture, dropping the internal moisture content of the timber to a perfect, highly combustible 12%. The trap was set. The physics were locked in place. The brutal arithmetic of the frontier had been calculated to the final decimal point. All that was left was for the winter to arrive. The storm that would be etched into the archives of the Wyoming Territory as the Great White Death did not announce itself with a roar. It arrived with a deceptive, terrifying silence on the afternoon of January 12, 1882. At 1 p.m., the sky over the Laramie Basin lost its color, turning the flat, lifeless shade of bruised iron. The barometric pressure plummeted so rapidly that horses in the local liveries began to kick at their stalls in a blind, instinctual panic. Dogs whined and crawled deep under elevated porches, seeking the farthest corners of the dirt. The ambient temperature, which had been a relatively mild 18 degrees, began a catastrophic freefall. By 3 p.m., the first precipitation began to fall. Not soft, drifting snow, but hard, crystalline ice pellets driven by a rising wind from the northwest. The temperature dropped to 5 degrees. By 6 p.m., the wind reached sustained speeds of 45 miles per hour, with gusts tearing across the open plains at over 60 miles per hour. The temperature was now 15 degrees. The snow was falling so densely and being whipped horizontally with such kinetic violence that visibility was reduced to absolute zero. This is the phenomenon known as a whiteout, a sensory void where the horizon disappears. The human eye cannot distinguish up from down, and a person can become hopelessly disoriented just 10 feet from their own front door. By midnight, the brutal arithmetic of the frontier had come to collect its debts. The mercury in the glass thermometer outside Martha Higgins's general store shrank until it bottomed out at a staggering 41 degrees. With the wind chill factoring in the 60-mile-per-hour gusts, the effective temperature on human skin was pushed close to 75 degrees. At this temperature, the physical rules of biology begin to break down. Exposed flesh freezes solid in under 2 minutes. The moisture in the ambient air crystallizes directly in the lungs, causing a sharp, metallic burning sensation with every drawn breath. Across the scattered homesteads of Laramie, the conventional wisdom of 19th-century American construction was failing catastrophically. Elias Galt, the arrogant master carpenter, was huddled inside his beautifully built conventional frame house. Because his house was elevated entirely on stone piers to avoid the rising damp of the ground, the 40 wind howled directly beneath his single-layer floorboards. The freezing air stripped the thermal energy out of his home faster than his cast-iron stove could ever hope to produce it. Worse, his firewood was stored exactly where tradition dictated it should be, in a proper, $45 milled lumber woodshed 30 feet from his back door. At 2:00 a.m., shivering uncontrollably as the indoor temperature dropped to 34°, Galt had to make a horrific choice. To get fuel, he had to tie a heavy hemp rope around his waist, secure the other end to his iron doorknob, and step out into the screaming void. He waded through waist-deep snowdrifts, blinded by the ice, struggling for every breath. When he finally reached his prized shed, he found that the fine, powdery snow had been driven by the sheer force of the wind through the microscopic gaps in the horizontal siding. His pristine woodpile was buried. Furthermore, the rapid temperature drop had caused the ambient humidity to condense and flash freeze on the timber itself. His dry wood was coated in a dense, millimeter-thick armor of solid ice. Desperate, he managed to drag an armful of the frozen logs back into his freezing house. He shoved the ice-encrusted timber into the dying embers of his stove. Physics is an unforgiving judge. The fire hissed and sputtered violently. The BTUs generated by the coals were instantly consumed by the phase change of the ice, wasted entirely on turning solid water into steam. The combustion temperature plummeted. Black, acrid smoke billowed out of the stove's draft, filling the room with choking soot. The temperature in Galt's cabin hovered at a lethal 28°. He wrapped himself in 3 wool blankets, curled into a corner, and prayed for dawn. Silas Thorne, the wealthy cattle baron, was faring no better. His massive 2-story home was a thermodynamic nightmare in a deep freeze. The high 12-foot ceilings, a symbol of his immense wealth, acted as a trap. Heat naturally rises. The massive fireplaces consumed staggering amounts of wood, but the 80-degree air instantly floated to the ceiling, leaving the living quarters near the floor at a bone-chilling 30°. His hired hands had stacked his primary firewood against the exterior leeward wall of the barn. The massive snowdrifts had completely encapsulated the pile. When his men tried to break the wood free with steel pickaxes, the frozen logs splintered wildly, and the axes bounced off the ice-welded timber. Without a steady supply of easily accessible, perfectly dry fuel, Thorne's sprawling, expensive mansion was rapidly becoming an ornate wooden tomb. Reverend Hale's church, a sprawling structure with high Gothic windows designed for aesthetics rather than insulation, was so thoroughly infiltrated by the wind that the holy water in the brass baptismal font froze solid, expanding until the metal cracked straight down the center with a sound like a pistol shot. But 2 miles away, inside Ilara Vance's cabin, the laws of physics were painting a very different, almost miraculous picture. At 3:15 a.m., with the wind threatening to tear the cedar shingles from her roof and the outside temperature holding steady at 45°, Ilara sat in her rocking chair. She was calmly knitting a woolen sock. She was wearing a simple cotton dress and a light woven shawl. The temperature inside her cabin was a stable, comforting 65°. Her survival was not luck. It was the inevitable result of thermodynamics. Because her massive 12 by 14-foot vault was dug deep into the earth, it operated as a colossal thermal battery. The deep earth surrounding the vault remained at its constant 50 Tadukudikwarkov. This meant that the massive pocket of air trapped beneath Ilara's floorboards was naturally heated to 50 Sotudagruform by the earth itself, utilizing the principle of thermal lag. In a conventional cabin like Ilias Galt's, the wood stove had to fight the ambient outdoor temperature. With it being 41°C outside, Galt's stove had to generate enough British thermal units to bridge a staggering temperature gap of 106 degrees just to reach a livable 65°. It was a mathematical impossibility for a single stove. But Ilara's cabin was sitting directly on top of a 52° thermal buffer. Her cast-iron cook stove only had to bridge the gap between the 50°C floor and the 65° room, a mere 13° delta. The thermal energy required to maintain her survival was exponentially lower than that of her wealthiest neighbors. Furthermore, her fuel source was absolute perfection. When the fire began to burn low, she did not have to don a heavy buffalo hide coat. She did not have to tie a lifeline to her waist. She did not have to face the blinding whiteout or swing a pickaxe at frozen snowdrifts. Ilara simply stood up, pushed aside her braided rag rug, and pulled the rope attached to the counterweighted pulley. The heavy 80-pound trapdoor swung open with a quiet creak. A wave of cool, dry, 52-degree air drifted up from the dark, carrying the rich, resinous scent of perfectly cured lodgepole pine. She climbed 3 steps down a short wooden ladder. In the subterranean dark, she grabbed 5 logs. They were bone dry, completely free of ice, and sat at an optimal 12% moisture content. She climbed back up, closed the trapdoor with a soft thud, and fed the stove. The dry wood ignited instantly. It released a massive, roaring burst of clean, efficient thermal energy. The Welsh mining ventilation system she had engineered worked flawlessly. The downcast pipe pulled in fresh outside air, which was instantly pre-warmed by the earth in the vault. The stove's updraft pulled that tempered air through the floor grate, ensuring the cabin never felt drafty, never felt stagnant, and never accumulated a single drop of condensation. For 3 full days and 3 agonizing nights, the blizzard battered the Wyoming territory. The town of Laramie ground to an absolute frozen halt. Cattle froze standing up in the fields, their lungs crystallized. Several homesteaders on the outskirts of town who had relied on outdoor woodpiles and drafty cabins succumbed to hypothermia. They would be found days later, wrapped in every blanket they owned, their skin pale blue, their fires long dead. On the morning of the 4th day, January 16th, the wind finally broke. The sky cleared to a piercing, cloudless blue that hurt the eyes. The temperature rose to a warm 18 degrees. Elias Galt and Silas Thorne, half frozen, physically exhausted and covered in black soot from their poorly burning, moisture-choked fires, strapped on snowshoes. They trudged through the 4-foot drifts toward Ilara's isolated claim. They did not speak during the walk. They expected to find a tragedy. They expected to find the floor collapsed into the pit, or the widow frozen stiff in her bed, a victim of her own foolish poverty. When they approached the cabin, they saw no woodshed. They saw no outdoor woodpile. They saw only a small, simple cabin, half buried in pristine, undisturbed snowdrifts. But from the stone chimney, a thin, perfectly clear stream of heat shimmered into the freezing air. There was no heavy black smoke, just the clean, invisible distortion of intense, efficient heat. Galt, his hands trembling inside his thick mittens, knocked on the heavy oak door. A moment later, the door swung open. Ilara Vance stood there. A wave of 65-degree heat rolled out of the doorway, hitting the 2 freezing men like a physical blow. The rich, intoxicating aroma of baking cornbread and brewing coffee drifted from the interior. "Mrs. Vance," Thorne rasped. His beard was crusted in solid ice, his eyes wide and uncomprehending as he stared past her into the perfectly dry, comfortably warm interior. We came to retrieve the body." Ilara wiped her hands on her flour-dusted apron. Her face remained an unreadable mask of frontier stoicism, shaped by years of hard labor and quiet observation. "There are no bodies here, gentlemen," she said softly. "Would you like to come inside and unthaw your bones? I assure you, the floor is quite stable." The aftermath of the Great White Death completely shifted the social and architectural hierarchy of the Laramie Basin. The mockery that had surrounded Ilara Vance evaporated, replaced by a stunned, almost reverent silence. Elias Galt, swallowing every ounce of his professional pride, spent 3 hours inside Ilara's cabin that afternoon. After drinking 2 cups of hot coffee, he asked her to open the trapdoor. He took a kerosene lantern and climbed down the short ladder into the subterranean vault. He ran his bare, calloused hands along the massive 12-inch lodgepole pine supports. He felt the dry, 52-degree air gently circulating through the ventilation shafts. He dropped to his knees and examined the perimeter drainage trench. The river rock sump was bone dry, exactly as Ilara had predicted it would be. Finally, he held the lantern up and inspected the underside of the pine floor joists. There was no dew point condensation. There was no black mold. There was no rot. The physics of vapor pressure and thermal draft had performed with absolute mathematical perfection. I was wrong, Galt said quietly, standing in the subterranean vault surrounded by 4 remaining cords of pristine, dry firewood. I have built 50 houses in this territory, Mrs. Vance, and not one of them is as smart as this hole in the ground. You didn't build a grave. You built an engine. Silas Thorne, the arrogant rancher, did not offer a verbal apology. Men of his wealth rarely did, but his actions spoke louder than any words could. By the spring thaw of 1882, Thorne had hired a crew of laborers to excavate a massive, reinforced subterranean thermal vault beneath his own sprawling ranch house, explicitly paying Ilara Vance a consulting fee of $20 to replicate her drainage and ventilation specifications. Even Reverend Hale was forced to issue a quiet retraction from his pulpit. The following Sunday, he preached a sermon on the virtues of prudent preparation, carefully noting that the Lord rewards those who use their God-given intellect to decipher the natural laws of the earth, rather than blindly following the herd. Ilara's secret vault was not a parlor trick. It was an early, vernacular implementation of concepts that are highly revered in modern sustainable architecture and green building. Today, structural engineers and architects refer to her techniques as earth sheltering, passive geothermal heat recovery, and earth air tubes, EATs. Modern passive house standards rely heavily on the exact same thermodynamic principles Ilara employed in 1881. By utilizing the Earth's constant subterranean temperature as a thermal mass to stabilize indoor climates, modern buildings dramatically reduce the energy payload required for heating and cooling. What the town of Laramie mocked as a bizarre hiding place was, in reality, a masterful manipulation of physics. By dropping her firewood storage below the frost line, Ilara not only protected her vital fuel from catastrophic weather, but she turned the negative space beneath her home into a massive, functioning thermal battery. Ilara Vance never patented her design. She never sought fame, and she never expanded her homestead into a sprawling empire. She lived quietly and comfortably on her Wyoming claim for another 37 years. She survived every brutal, landscape-altering winter that followed without ever once having to step into a blizzard to fetch wood. When she finally passed away in her sleep in the autumn of 1918, at the age of 75, her obituary in the Laramie Boomerang did not mention the subterranean vault. It merely noted that she was one of the sharpest, most resilient pioneers in the territory, a woman who understood the land better than most men. Her wooden cabin eventually succumbed to the elements and the relentless push of modern development in the mid-20th century. The above-ground structure was torn down, but local historians and archaeologists who surveyed the site in the 1980s found something remarkable beneath the overgrown sagebrush. The deep 14 by 12-foot excavation was still perfectly intact. The heavy river rock sump still drained water efficiently away from the center, and the earth below the frost line was still holding steady at 52 degrees, patiently waiting to offer its warmth to anyone smart enough to stop fighting the cold and start using the earth. If you found value in this story, if it made you appreciate the brilliant, forgotten engineering of the people who settled this harsh continent, hit that like button to help others find these stories of creativity. Subscribe to preserve this knowledge. The old ways weren't just about surviving, they were about mastering the physics of the world. Let's make sure that wisdom never disappears.